Who will win the 2025 Australian federal election? That's a question that almost everyone is asking as we draw to the close of one of the most depressing, terrible election campaigns in recent memory. Neither major party has done a particularly good job. And on the one hand, we've got Anthony Albanese, who just continually lies about everything, and we've got Peter Dutton, who seems to prevaricate and doesn't have a message cut through, and seems to just go to focus groups to try to work out what he needs to say to the media. Neither of them have been particularly inspirational. But like I've said before, I regard Peter Dutton as less terrible than Anthony Albanese, albeit he has some significant issues. Now, I've talked about a lot of this in the past. The primary purpose of this video is to talk about who I think is going to win the election, because we are at the home stretch of the voting at the moment. And in short, I'm almost certain it's going to be Anthony Albanese. I think there's a decent chance he'll be restored in minority government form rather than majority government form, but it is really too close to call exactly how it turns out, in my opinion. So what I'll talk about is the polling that we've seen, and I'll talk about why it is that Peter Dutton appears to have dropped the ball on this. And if you've got any thoughts about this, or you want to talk about how you're voting, well, let me know that in the comments below. Alright, so let's start off with the polling, because that gives us an idea about the election's mood. Well, here what we're seeing is a similar type of polling to 2022, but there are some important differences. In short, on the two-party preferred vote, Labour is about 53-ish, the Liberals are about 47-ish, but there is some variation across polling outlets. Now, I've also seen the Liberals go down toward the home stretch in the 2025 election. However, a lot of this polling comes in with a lag, and therefore it won't automatically reflect the last week of campaigning, where Peter Dutton really has gotten things into gear and has been less awful than he has throughout the entire rest of the campaign. He has finally found some areas that he's actually going to attack Labour on, and has finally actually decided to stop treating them with kid gloves. He's decided to finally call out Anthony Albanese's lies and skewer them on things such as tax hikes. However, it's likely too little too late, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Regardless, the two-party preferred is at about that 53 to 47 depending on the outlet. Now, to be clear here, due to our preferential voting system in Australia, that means that the Liberal Party can be up on the primary vote, i.e. people's first preferences, but still lose after preferences are redistributed, especially when those preferences are coming from parties like the Greens, which, for example, Labour has preferenced second, seemingly as part of a preference deal with the Greens to encourage people to try to vote for Labour. Regardless, it appears Labour's likely to win. Now let's compare this with 2022. Now the result of the 2022 election was Labour came in with a very slim majority. Very slim. They don't really have any room to lose seats. The thing in 2022 is Labour was in a slightly better position than 2025. By which I mean the two-party preferred was around that 53-47, but there was more variation on the downside. So more polls were coming in that 45-46 to the Liberals, 53-54, etc. to Labour. By contrast, this time, Liberals have a slightly higher two-party preferred, and it's been consistently a bit higher than it was in 2022. Furthermore, when we compare 2025 to 2022, well, in the home stretch of the campaign, the Liberals have done a less terrible job than they did in 2022, and Peter Dutton is less on the nose than Scott Morrison was. Now, of course, Peter Dutton can make up ground and have a better two-party preferred through two major paths, either taking seats from Labour or by taking seats from the Teals. It's very unlikely they're going to get many seats, if any, from the Greens, although there has been some talk about that on the one hand in Queensland, for example. However, I'm going to focus on the Teals and Labour. There's a lot of talk about the Liberals being able to pick up some seats from Labour in outer suburban areas, especially in Victoria, where Labour is very, very unpopular. Whether they succeed is not totally clear, but it appears there's going to be a swing toward the Liberals there, but the magnitude might not be sufficient for them to pick up those seats. But there's a decent chance. And if the Liberals start picking up one or two seats from Labour, well, automatically Labour's majority is going to go by the wayside. The Liberals won't pick up enough seats to be able to form government because Labour will still have more seats, but Labour could be in trouble. Labour could help to mitigate this by picking up seats from the Greens. For example, Max Chandler-Mayer has his electorate in Queensland, particularly in a seat that used to be held by Labour. Now, Max Chandler-Mayer is a Greens candidate, and he is truly catastrophically terrible policy-wise. But people still vote for people with terrible policies, who are just unrealistic and truly awful. He is catastrophically worse than the Labour Party. And they might pick up his seat, just because he's such a trash fire policy-wise. And the Greens have been truly terrible in this election. However, it's not a certainty. So say, for example, Labour loses 1 or 2 seats to the Liberals in Victoria, but they pick up 1 or 2 from the Greens, well, it comes out on net. The Liberals might pick up a couple of seats from the Teals. For example, we've got Curtin in Western Australia, Kooyong in Victoria, and Goldstein in Victoria. Those seem to be the most likely to go toward the Liberals. It seems unlikely that seats like Wentworth are going to go toward the Liberals. Unfortunately, in my opinion, of course, as viewers of this channel will realise, I'm not particularly a fan of Allegra Spender. Now, this is of course in part because I'm in her electorate and she blocked me on Twitter after I'd criticised her policies. She seems incredibly thin-skinned, and seemingly her team just wants to bury criticism. And if her team is blocking me on social media, she's hardly my local representative. Regardless, it appears the Liberals are likely to lose, and Labour has a decent chance of falling into minority government, relying on the Teals and potentially the Greens for support. This is also reflected in the betting markets, where the betting markets have Peter Dutton as, well, very unlikely to win. They've got his odds at like 9.5. The payout of him winning would be very, very high if he were to win, but it doesn't appear to be very likely. This doesn't appear to be like the election where Scott Morrison won the unwinnable election from Bill Shorten. Because all the way back then, if you remember back then, we had the climate where there were a lot of quiet conservatives, a lot of people that were supporting conservative parties, but felt pressured to not say they were doing so, who felt pressured to hide the fact that they were voting for the Liberals. We appear to be less in that environment at the moment. Certainly there still are all of the vitriolic, aggressive people on the left. However, I feel that more people are willing to say they're supporting the Liberals than they were in 2019. Because in 2019, the media seemingly was going out and painting all Liberal supporters as racist, sexist, or homophobic, and therefore people wouldn't say anything. Right now, Anthony Albanese is so unpopular that even if people are voting for Anthony Albanese and you say you're voting for Peter Dutton, they at least kind of realise that Anthony Albanese is a trash candidate, and they can probably empathise with why one does not like him. But like I've said, the betting markets do have Labour as the favourite to win, and the betting markets do actually, at least according to Sportsbet, have Anthony Albanese as likely to form majority government. And like I've said, I think that's a strong possibility. I think it's too close to call whether it's going to be majority or minority. I'm not necessarily sure I would want to be betting on Labour minority versus majority, really. But that's where the betting markets are. There's also all manner of other random things you can bet on, which I guess are really just a gamble, such as what tie colour are Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton going to wear during their concession speeches, amongst other things. So far we've talked about the polling, but why is it that the polling is so bad for Peter Dutton? Well, I've addressed some of this in prior videos, so I'm only going to touch on it in a little bit of detail here, but basically it's because, in my opinion, Peter Dutton has dropped the ball on the campaign. He could have done a significantly better campaign. He could have run a significantly better campaign where he called out Anthony Albanese's lies, and he actually had clear message cut through. As people such as Andrew Bolt or people like Bearing on YouTube have pointed out, and done a much better job than me at pointing this out, Peter Dutton simply has not had message cut through. Andrew Bolt highlighted that Peter Dutton simply had not created a coherent message. There was a grab bag of seemingly disconnected policies, but he had not taken the effort to draw these all together into a narrative, something that would give people an idea about what he stood for. Now, of course, we can all piece this together, but we shouldn't need to be piecing it together. Peter Dutton should be communicating it to voters who aren't paying attention to the political system. Furthermore, he simply became vulnerable to the smear campaigns coming up from Labour because he didn't push back clearly enough. I'm honestly astounded that he didn't come out and outright say that Labour is lying. And he didn't say that Labour was lying early and frequently, because Labour has been lying continually. Rather, he'd use slightly euphemistic terms such as Anthony Albanese has a problem with the truth, or things along those lines, whereas he should have just said Anthony Albanese is lying. But he didn't do that. It seems like he was just trying to be too nice. He was a damp sponge. He simply didn't have the message cut through. Now, to be fair to Peter Dutton, this was his first campaign. I think he's going to do significantly better in his next campaign, and I would probably give him a chance to run the next election campaign because he's probably going to do a much better job. He's probably learned his lesson to not fall victim to these smears. What he should have done is when you're being smeared and when people are lying about you, you should call them out for these lies. It's not incumbent upon you to be nice to the person that is lying about you and smearing you. You have to assertively push back against that. And he simply hasn't done that. And that's why I think their election campaign has done badly. Now, I'll revisit this after we know the election result and give you a full post-mortem on it. But if you've got any thoughts about this and who is likely to win, well, let me know that in the comments below.